why don't we get started?
Let's do it.
Okay. So
hello
everyone, and welcome to the Arena Series. We're super excited to have you all with us here tonight. This series is a space where we talk about topics that men don't often talk about. And our intention today, like it is every day, is to inspire people to trust themselves, to live authentically and vulnerably, and to step into the arena in their personal and professional lives. We were inspired to call this the Arena Series from the work that Brene Brown has done around vulnerability and Teddy Roosevelt's famous Man in the Arena speech. Our vision is for all of you to be people in the arena, striving valiantly forward like never before in the direction of what's important to you. I'm Coach Jake. I'm an executive and personal coach who is trained with the former head of coaching at Google, and I've worked with men for over half a decade. I help men make and navigate their most important choices. I work with small business owners, mid-level executives, and I run the Arena Men's Group alongside Coach Nick. Coach Nick and I are also finishing the final draft of a novel about a fictional men's group that we're super excited to be bringing to the world soon. We've been working on it for 5.5 years, and we're really ready to get this into the world. That's
yes,
me.
We are definitely ready
Jake.
for the book.
Yes, we're ready for the book.
Awesome, Jake. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us tonight for Men and Intimacy. We're also streaming live on Facebook, so hello to our friends there as well. I'm Nick Papadopoulos, affectionately known or called Coach Nick. I work both in the corporate space and the personal development space. In the corporate space, I'm a facilitator, executive coach, organizational development consultant and expert. On the personal development side, like Jake mentioned, I run men's groups. Jake and I run one of those together, the Arena Series, as he referenced. No matter if it's the corporate world or personal development space, my purpose is to inspire men, inspire people, inspire teams to live life purposefully, to operate purposefully, and to transform the world. That's really code for getting in the arena and making things happen, right? And making the world a different place. Jake mentioned the men's group, the Arena Series. It's a bi-weekly men's group that we run virtually. It's a men's group. It's a community of men who come together every 2 weeks to support each other, to tell on themselves, to hold each other accountable, to hold each other in our or their highest possibilities, and together to redefine what it means to be a man in 2021, which is pretty exciting. So again, welcome. Thank you so much. We hope to provide value and insight into our conversation, and looking forward to our third panelist, Dr. Koblenz, that's going to come up soon.
Absolutely. And as you all know, tonight we're here to talk about men and intimacy, and Dr. Koblenz will be joining us in about 20 minutes, and she'll be lending her expertise to this rich conversation. So why don't we jump right in? I love to start fast.
Ooh, hot seat already. We're on the hot seat
already.
I love it.
So Nick, one of the questions we got leading up to tonight was, what is intimacy and how does it impact relationships? How would you answer that question?
So there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. One is that we often confuse intimacy with sex or purely sex. We often even say, have you been intimate with that person, which often implies that you've been physical with them. And so part of the conversation tonight, the intention for tonight, one of the intentions, is that intimacy shows up in a variety of ways. Certainly physical, sexual can be one, and there are so many other ways, right? So that's the first point I want to make. The second is that, to me, intimacy is the ultimate experience of being known, the ultimate experience of deep, meaningful connection, right? It's the experience where all parties trust themselves and each other to be seen and to be heard, right? For me to trust myself enough to be seen and to be heard, and then to hold a space for you, right? For everyone, on this call for that matter, to also be seen and to be heard. To me, it's the experience of being gotten. In my work, both in the corporate setting and in my personal development work, what people want most is to be known, is to be gotten. It's being still with another person and being known wholly and completely. Let me just share an example of what I mean, in case that sounded like a bunch of, stuff. I was in a personal development workshop many, many moons ago. And one of the participants, it was a female or someone who identified as a female, was sharing in her first day and a half about how much she had poor experiences with men, how she didn't trust men. She was heterosexual. She identified that way. She didn't trust men. She didn't like men. Men had hurt her, and she was done. She was done dating, even though she still wanted to be in a relationship. She just couldn't reconcile how poorly she had been treated in her relationships. And we did an exercise called Be With. It was called a Be With exercise. And this is a really good example of intimacy, especially for men. So this is really a shout out for men. Often we have it as men that we have to do things, fix things, move things. And the Be With was really two people standing across from each other, I don't know, a couple of feet, looking into each other's eyes. And the objective was for me to get into her world, to sort of put myself emotionally, energetically into her world without any of my judgments, really as an open vessel, right? To really just get over there where she was and to have her feel known. And we didn't say a word. Again, as men, we often think we have to do things, say things, fix things. What I was doing, if you want to call it a doing, was I was being over there with her, right? I was really connected to her experiences of hurt, her experiences of wanting a deep, meaningful relationship, her experience of being a woman, and me being a man for that matter, right? And I would say within about 5 minutes, she broke down, started crying, she ran out of the room. I'm thinking, oh shoot, I did something wrong, right? Because I'm back in my man, mode of like, I did it the wrong way. I got to do better the next. She came back into the room and she shared, when we did the debrief, she shared and she said, she actually used the word, she said, Nick didn't say anything, obviously. Nick didn't do anything, except he held the space for me. He got me. He got my pain. He also created a space where I could actually see the possibility of being intimate with a man because of the way he was being with me, which is the exercise, the being with. And so for me, intimacy, is that experience that I just described. Where we're being still with someone and giving them that experience of being known. And I'll just share one other example. I mentioned, Jake, that we run this bi-monthly men's group called the Arena Series. This past Tuesday, we had our one of our men's sessions. And we were having a discussion like we always do. And one of the men in the group, and by the way, this is virtual, that we do this every 2 weeks. One of the men in the group shared about how his father is dying, is passing away. And was sharing vulnerably, from a really raw place, his feelings, his experience of it. And the other men didn't do anything from the traditional sense of saying anything, doing anything, giving advice like men like to do, right? The mansplaining that we call it sometimes. Men just listened and held the space for him. And, I asked, the only thing we did, at some point I asked the question, I said, do you think you're a good son? And he just broke down and cried. And everyone in the room was crying, the virtual room was crying. And it was an intimate experience, right? Which was really, really powerful to have with a man in particular, and obviously with other humans. So you put me on the hot seat first. I'm going to put you on the hot seat and ask you the same question. How would you define, or what's your perspective on intimacy?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this since we decided that this was going to be our topic. And to be honest, up until the last few days, I was really thinking, oh my goodness, I am not nearly an expert on intimacy enough to talk about this. And by no means do I claim to be an expert on intimacy, but as we talked about it, and yesterday you and I and Dr. Koblenz sat down and had a little conversation before tonight, and that really got my mind turning, that when we started talking about intimacy and the idea of it being this stillness, I really connected with that. And for me, I'm a writer. And so I went to the dictionary. I was like, what is the definition of intimacy? And it's closeness. That's ultimately what it means. And it comes from a Indo-European root meaning to be close. And for me, that's what intimacy is. But it's more than that, because intimacy is one of those things that, at least for me, I can never really describe. But I also always know when I'm in an intimate moment. It's like this intangible feeling of belonging, this intangible feeling of closeness. And I know in those moments, it's this feeling of, oh my goodness, this is what I want. Like, this experience is what I want. And sometimes it's fleeting for seconds, sometimes it's longer, and sometimes it's a low hum in the background. And so for me, I would say intimacy is that intangible feeling of belonging, that space of being gotten, of being understood, of being seen and seeing. And I will say, I didn't always think that if I look at how I've thought about intimacy in the past, definitely growing up, intimacy was always linked with sex, that intimacy is sex, that you be intimate with somebody. And I don't think I ever thought about intimacy with my male friends. It just wasn't part of the conversation, probably until about 6 years ago when I started doing development work. And even then, I wouldn't have called it intimacy. It would have been like, oh yeah, they're my best friends, I'm close with them. But when I started doing this work, I started thinking intimacy had to look a certain way, that intimacy was being really vulnerable and talking about something really meaningful and having that direct eye contact and having a lot of that silence and those heavy, precious moments. And I have a friend, and when I started doing this work, that's what I wanted to create with him. I wanted him to have that experience, for us to have these deep, meaningful moments. And I kept pushing for that. And I think it made him really uncomfortable, because for him, he didn't want that. He wasn't comfortable with that. And for a year, I kept pushing this, because for me, I got hooked on, oh, that's intimacy.
Right.
And it wasn't until I started finally realizing, oh, wait a second, this is the thing I'm doing is the complete opposite of intimacy.
Right.
I'm not seeing him. I'm not listening to him. I'm thinking that intimacy is some set of rules that you find in a book that says it's vulnerability and sharing deeply. Whereas what led us to have an intimate friendship, I get emotional talking about it, is we listened to a different album every week for 2.5 years. And that was our access point for intimacy. Like, we connected over the music that we loved.
Yeah.
And it led, now we talk about everything. But 6 years ago, I thought it had to look one way. And it took 2.5 years of being intimate in a way that you won't find in a rule book to open up our relationship. And that was just, you can see how much it means to me. Super, super powerful.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. Yeah, that's why I started by saying intimacy is so much more than the physical part, right? Yes, it can be sexual, it can be physical, and it can be sharing, like you said, a record, an album every month, and again, it goes back to that experience of deep, meaningful connection and being seen and being known and being heard, right, in that space.
Nick, let me ask you this. For you, what's gotten in the way of intimacy for you in the past?
For me personally,
for you personally.
For me personally, I was going to answer it more globally.
Let's get intimate, Nick. Let's get intimate.
Let's get intimate. So, I believe, I'll say this statement simply. I believe one of the reasons why we avoid intimacy is because we don't trust ourselves, and therefore we don't trust others, okay? And there's a variety of reasons of why we don't trust ourselves and when that trust gets broken. For me personally, one of my first intimate relationships, right, important relationships, was when I was about 10 years old, was with my teacher. It was my science teacher, gym teacher as well, and also our scoutmaster at our school. And he's a gentleman who broke my trust. He sexually abused me. He sexually abused, many of my friends. And so that was really one of my first experiences of intimacy. Here was a human who, said all the right things about, I'm here to take care of you. I'm here to guide you. I'm here to mentor you. I'm here to teach you about sex and how to be with women, because I was identified as heterosexual from a young age. And proceeded to break my trust along with others, but I'm speaking for myself right now. And so for me, that was my first, one of the most important experiences with another human. And so for me, what gets in the way of intimacy is, shit, who wants to get hurt like that again? I mean, that was, still is painful. I mean, intimacy is supposed to be a place where, again, you feel heard, seen, which is really the experience of feeling safe. And so for me, it's been a lifelong journey, a lifelong process in jumping back into the arena. Where I've landed personally, and this is my invitation to others, is that regardless if you guard yourself or not, you still run the risk of getting hurt. Regardless if you guard yourself or not, because you don't trust, or your trust has been broken, like I'm describing for myself, you still run those risks. And so I'd rather run the risk and feel alive. Again, as challenging as it may be, you can have the challenge, right, and have the anxiety, and still jump into the arena of intimacy, right? And because what's possible is pretty amazing. Even you just sharing the way that you shared, it's like the opportunity for me personally to connect with you on that level. That's delicious. I mean, that's worth a whole lot. And I'd rather have that along with, hey, I might get hurt again. So yeah, I think it's trust. I think that for me has, gotten in the way, and, disrupting that narrative, meaning that if you trust and you put yourself out there, that bad things will happen, and it's really disrupting that narrative and saying, put yourself out there and everything will happen. Everything will show up in the arena.
Really appreciate you sharing all of that, Nick, and being so vulnerable and intimate here, both with me as we're sitting here, and also with everyone who's joined us tonight. What you're saying reminds me of something that a coach that I used to follow on Instagram says, and I'm not on Instagram anymore, so I don't follow him, but his name's Sean Galanos, and he's a love and relationship coach, and he says that heartbreak is the buy-in for love. And I would say that heartbreak is the buy-in for any form of relationship, whether it's romantic or platonic or familial or even a professional relationship. Yeah. That real relationships are when I put myself on the line. And there's always that possibility of heartbreak and hurt.
Yeah, someone asked a question in the chat, what is vulnerability? And I there's lots of ways to answer that. I believe you started to answer that. I mean, it's saying I love you, not knowing if you're going to get that back. Or, when I drop my kids off in the morning at school, not knowing if I'm going to see them again. Right, based on the craziness that goes on in our country, right, with schools and all that, it's not knowing yet still loving, right, still putting yourself out there. So yeah, let me ask you the same question. What do you believe gets in the way for you around intimacy, or what has you avoided when you do? Yeah,
so I mean, one, I think trust, you nailed it, and I was thinking about this question before because I knew we were gonna talk about it, and I hadn't gotten to trust, but I want to separate it into two different areas. I think with men, what's gotten in the way of intimacy is the fear of judgment, and just because it's not something that men, and I should say, it's not something I've done a lot with my male friends before the last few years.
Yeah.
that it's just not part of the lingo, it's not part of the language. And so even today, I'm intimate with my male friends very differently with some of them than I am with others. And I know I'm attuned to things, so I notice when there's discomfort involved. I'm like,
Right.
okay, I'm not going to be intimate in that way. I
Right.
have one friend who every time I express, I'm so glad we did this. Like, this was so wonderful. He was like, it was all right. And it's like, I know for him, I know he feels the same way, but acknowledging it is such a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, men are told, not to show emotions, because that shows weakness, right? There's this man box paradigm, right? That be a man, toughen up, change the tire. You're supposed to be the one that knows how to change the tire. I've been with partners, and by the way, for those out there, if we're ever in a car together, I don't know how to change a tire. I'm not saying I shouldn't, but I've been told in my heterosexual relationships how I'm not a man because I don't know how to change a tire. Now, I may be an irresponsible human for not knowing how to change a tire because I own a car, but I'm no less of a man because I don't know how to change a tire, right? I think that men are told not to show emotion, like you were just describing, Jake, and I think because often if we show emotion, we're being too needy. We're being too girly. We're being gay, especially if you're heterosexual, right? And men just don't do that kind of thing, right? And I just want to share, the impact of being told not to show your emotion, right? Like you did, a few minutes ago. There was a study that states 40, almost half of Americans report that they either sometimes or always feel alone. So when you tell a man that they have to be a certain way or not to be a certain way, that one of the outcomes is isolation, is disconnection. The CDC talks about, isolation, that it significantly increases a person's risk of premature death. And it rivals smoking, obesity, and physical inactivity. It includes, when we feel isolated, we have higher levels of heart disease, diabetes, cancer, and more. And so I do think, when people say men are in their cave, because we run a men's group like we've described. I've been running men's groups now for 14 years. Part of the reason why we go to the cave is because we actually feel alone. It's not because we're being bratty or we want to be jerks. We feel alone and we don't feel known, which is, again, the opposite of the experience that intimacy creates.
Absolutely. And I want to bring on Dr. Koblenz in a second, but I want to speak to the second part of what's got in the way of intimacy for me when it comes to women. So I think it's really interesting, which is, like I said at the beginning, I think intimacy and sex have been so tied together, especially when it comes to men and women. I'm also heterosexual, and so always, been attracted to women. And I've always had good female friends throughout my life, but sex has always been one of those things that has lurked in the background and been seen as the highest form of intimacy. I think our culture sets it up that way.
Yeah.
And that's actually gone in my way of having sustainable intimate relationships with women that aren't sexual, that are. Because I know for me, every time I've had intimate experiences or moments, I mean, those moments of sharing something really deeply, or things like listening to an album for 2.5 years,
Right.
obviously different with different people, that when it's come to women, it's always been like, well, I've got to level it up. Like, okay, we had this great intimate moment. How do I bring it to the next level? So next week we have a more intimate moment.
Right.
And one of the things I've worked on and continue to work on and learn, because it's a continuous learning for me, this still gets in my way, is that there is no level upping when it comes to intimacy.
Yeah.
That intimacy is intimacy.
Yes.
That listening to an album every week for 2.5 years is as intimate as a physical relationship. They're different, but they're both intimacy. And I think for me, it's really important that I can't level it up, that a moment of intimacy is a moment of intimacy, and that's beautiful and meaningful and important. And as long as I'm trying to level up and as if there's more to accomplish or more to gain, that I'm actually not experiencing intimacy or creating intimacy in those moments.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's what's gotten in my way with women over the years, is just that obsession with, okay, I've got to take it to the next level,
Right.
versus really being with, as you were saying earlier,
I
the
was gonna
moment that is
say,
there.
yeah, I was gonna say, when you talk about the leveling up, you're in your head.
Totally.
You're over here. If those of you can see me on the camera, when you're in what you were describing, you're over here. When you're in that be with exercise, like I described at the very beginning, you're over there. And
Yes.
the person's having the experience of being known and being heard and gotten and understood. It's why that woman who was 2 feet away from me, just looking in each other's eyes, just broke down, because she was like, wow, someone actually got me. And for me, it was like, holy like I've now had a breakthrough on how to be intimate and how to create a connection.
Absolutely. Well, let's bring on Dr. Koblenz. I'm going to put her on the screen with us.
Are we putting her on the hot seat?
Of
Great,
course.
I'm ready.
But
I'm ready
first,
for it.
let me introduce her. So Dr. Koblenz is a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of New York since 2012 and the founder of Cornerstone Psychological Services. She is a faculty member of Harlem Hospital, an affiliate of Columbia University, teaching psychiatry residents and psychology doctoral students. Her areas of clinical expertise include trauma, loss, relationship issues, and life transitions. And we are thrilled to have Dr. Koblenz with us today. She was on a panel with us almost 2 years ago on men and vulnerability. And it's so nice to see you again and have you here.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Hi, Jessica.
Hi.
So Nick, do you want to put Jessica on the hot seat?
Yeah, feel free. I also want to respond so much to everything that's been said.
Why don't you start there?
Go ahead.
Go start there.
One of the themes that I thought was interesting that we were kind of talking around was, it kind of feels like the juxtaposition between the golden rule and the platinum rule. So the golden rule is treating other people the way we want to be treated, right? And the platinum rule is treating other people the way they want to be treated. And I think some of the experiences of those missed attunements of like times that we're trying to force that intimacy, whether it's in a dating context of like, okay, we have to keep leveling this up, and how do we create, like last time was magical, so this has to be more magical and like more fireworks, right? And even with your buddy who's like, you're like, isn't this amazing? And someone's like, and they're a little more reserved and thinking about it, that I think it's just interesting the context of how does that intimacy get created in terms of what's on our agenda and the way that we feel close versus holding the space in a way that works for someone else. And one of the questions that came up was the cultural and social issues. And we were talking about this on our call, and I think it's such an interesting kind of umbrella of so many things, right? What are the messages that we get about being open? Is this something that's a trait that's really valued, or does it seem like it's looked down upon? And how do we navigate that? And like, I've had run-ins like that with people who, I tend to wear my heart on my sleeves. I'm very expressive and effusive, and then there is that kind of gap of like someone who might be more reserved or who comes from a background where like, oh no, we don't hug, we don't jump into this, and kind of like holding that space.
Yeah, so actually that reminds me of something we talked about between extroverts and introverts, right? And we're labeling folks that way, but for the purposes of this conversation, how can an extrovert and an introvert be intimate? On the surface, they may be very, very different. Each one gets their energy from, different sources in different ways. Are they doomed in a relationship? Or is there hope?
Or do they have to only have the intimacy behind closed doors when no one else is around, as opposed to two extroverts who could have a room full of people but still have that intimate moment shared with each other? Yeah,
absolutely. Let me ask this question: what's possible? We're talking about men and intimacy, so I feel like it's important for us to ask the question. From your experience working with with patients, working with groups. What is possible when men access intimacy? And the part two to that is, how can a man access intimacy? I think it's one of the questions in the chat, I believe. From your perspective, what's the pathway to accessing it, and what's possible when men go there?
I mean, I think that you were just an amazing model of that, Nick. Like, I think when you tackle like the biggest vulnerability and struggles that you have, and you're able to kind of tap into that and unleash it, and have this mind over matter, like really confrontation of fear, I think it has this amazing potential to unlock. And I think something that's really sad is that there's a pretty high risk to reward ratio there, right? Like, you don't know, are you going to be putting your heart out there, and like what's going to happen is, are you going to be abused? Are you going to be in pain? Are you going to be neglected? Are you going to be held and loved and comforted? And kind of that question of like, what will be unlocked? And I think one of the things that really benefits men who are able to open up is that reward, like that yumminess of like how much it makes me think about my husband with our two girls, right? And like, he's so effusive and warm, and like the response that he gets back is like these like total mushy moments that are so lovely. And we have other friends who's, as fathers, there's more of a stoic sense, and it's kind of hard to give as much. And I think you see it in the response of how the kids are, because the kids learn that like you have to be a bit more structured and organized, and like, that doesn't really lend itself to like, I love you, daddy, and like all of the benefits, of being able to open up.
Yeah, you
What
just
are those?
reminded me. Sorry, Jake, I just wanted to say this. It reminds me, Jake and I do a daily appreciation journal. I appreciate fill in the blank. And often what's in my appreciation journal is holding hands with, I have two sons, one's 11 and a half and one's 7 and a half. My 11 and a half wants nothing to do with me already. But my 7 and a half will still hold my hand. And when we watch movies, on Friday nights, we do family night, he'll cuddle up. And I mean, for me, that is, you talk about how intimacy can show up in so many different ways. It is yummy, like you said. I mean, and it was interesting, just real quick, my 11 and a half year old, we went to opening day for the Yankees this year. And obviously it was the first time, this is being recorded, Jake.
I know, but I'm a Red Sox fan. We had to get it in there somehow.
It was the first time we had, gone to a game, obviously in about a year and a half. And my older, we ran into the stadium. It was really exciting. My older son actually held my hand for about 5 seconds. And it's those moments, it's the holding the hands, the cuddling up. For me, is it fills my intimacy bucket. It's so important for me as a human to thrive. And that's my invitation to others, is that intimacy creates a healthy you, therefore healthy others.
I think in the time of COVID too, people are really feeling the struggle of that, because if you're in a situation where you're constantly being nurtured, then it expands, exponentially, right? Where like there's so many moments, and like the family closeness that we've all witnessed, where there's much more room for those intimate moments. And then there's also a lot more isolation of people who were kind of stuck in situations where there was no one around, or trapped in family situations that were either painful or domestic violence, or couples that kind of were on the verge of divorce and then were then trapped together. And it's really a time where I think this is exacerbating whatever that underlying dynamic was.
What are the barriers that you see getting in the way of intimacy with the clients that you work with?
You're asking me?
Yes.
The barriers to intimacy, I think when you asked that question of like, what were each of our barriers, what I thought of was the self-protection, right? That like, when that wall is up, there's something really protective about being able to say, you're in your fortress, right? So like you're in your cave, whatever it is, right? So that you can say, I'm in control of this. And I think if people have trauma that hasn't been healed, if they've been in situations where they're not sure what they're going to get, or if they're chasing relationships that are filled with someone who might have a personality disorder, or someone who doesn't have that love to give, or culturally they just know they're never going to get it. And a lot of clients get stuck, and a lot of us get stuck, right? Like we keep going to the hardware store expecting oranges. We have to stop.
I've done that. I've done that plenty of times.
We're all doing it. And, and there's parents, or there's, aunts or uncles, or different situations, or that person or that friend, that it's a really frustrating struggle where like there's a craving for the intimacy, but maybe there isn't the awareness of how to get it. And maybe there's a further acceptance that that person might not ever be capable of giving you the type of intimacy you're looking for. Mm-hmm. And how painful is that, and how do we accept that, in the same way that when we started talking about like the golden rule versus the platinum rule, and realizing, well, maybe this is the upper threshold of what this person can give. This is what this person is. That's what intimacy looks like for this other person. And how special is it that you're included? Maybe your threshold is this much and they're only giving this much, but look at how much they treasure you, that they're opening up that much to you.
Yeah, and I know I've had that experience where there's been a misalignment there. And, I talked about one of the barriers for me is that leveling up of intimacy. Well, those don't go well together when there's a misalignment in that platinum rule, where, the intimacy that I want and can give is different than the person across from me. And I'm trying to level it up. In fact, what it creates is disconnection. Right. And there is, what I'm hearing and what you're saying is there's so much beauty in accepting the intimacy that someone can give, regardless of if it matches up or not.
Yeah. And I think there's also the reality of like intimacy is something that takes time. Like people, and especially now, like in this kind of, swipe right culture, like it's, people don't want to wait. Like they want to show up, they want to have the intimate moment. They want to like, okay, like, are we doing this? We already see it, we already know what this is. And especially with COVID, like there's, what dating looked like in the time of COVID and what clients were experiencing. And like, okay, they wanted to hook up with someone, but like at the risk of potentially killing their parents, like just like crazy, like the ways in which humans have become weaponized because of COVID. Right? Like created so many barriers of intimacy. And how did people handle different precautions, and who was more cautious, who was less cautious, and how many feelings were hurt in the process of like feeling potentially rejected, but the person's also feeling like they're just trying to not die, like there's all of these, like the fact that humans have become armor and a weapon is like a really scary idea in terms of intimacy. And now we're literally in a time when everyone's walking around and who's wearing a mask and who isn't. And this is like a constant evolving discussion. And so I think the fact that we're talking about intimacy and like on a virtual platform, as opposed to what might have felt more intimate a few years ago when we were in person in that really loving, amazing group, we're at a time when we're really feeling, and there's like an existential longing for that intimacy.
Yeah, I believe what I'm hearing you say, Jessica, is one of the outcomes of COVID is, well, number one, you can be intimate in any environment, at any time. I've never prescribed to this notion of, at work you're one way, at home you're another way. I had a mentor of mine years ago who said, we bring ourselves everywhere. And I believe that you can be intentional about being intimate. Intimacy is a way of being. It creates the experience of connection. It creates the experience of being known, like we've been talking about. And so, one of the benefits of COVID is that in a virtual environment, you can be intimate. I described at the very beginning, we had our men's group session 2 days ago, and this man was sharing about his deep sorrow, his pain that he's feeling about his dying father, and that he may have not been the best son. And you had a room full of men crying, and you had a room full of men who said, thank you for sharing that way, because you just had me get close with my father, alive or not. It didn't matter. Like my father's passed, and my father was sitting right next to me in that moment, and this was on a camera. So I believe there's an opportunity always for intimacy.
Yeah, there's a really great book that's out recently by Hope Edelman, and it's called After Grief. And it really touches on the ability to continue that relationship with people after they've gone,
Mhm.
and the lifelong nature of grieving, and kind of looking at that. And I completely relate to that. Part of what I was doing during COVID was these corporate consultations, and I would be doing these lectures, and sometimes for 200 people. And so you're seeing just like the seas of like black boxes with no one on their videos, and it's like a very strange moment. But there was so much intimacy that was able to be gathered, because this was for frontline workers, and hearing these like unbelievable stories of trauma and what everyone was going through, but the shared experiences that people felt and how nurtured and supported they could feel, even in a virtual room of strangers, is really amazing. Like we're so hungry for it.
Yeah.
It comes back to, and Brene Brown writes about this, that the thing people want most is that sense of belonging, that we're going to find that one way or the other. And I think the last 15 months, even with all of the virtual events and conversations, both groups and one-on-one, we were all able to find, or I shouldn't speak for everyone, I was able to find a sense of belonging, despite the fact that at the beginning of COVID, I didn't spend time with another person in person for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And still was able to create intimacy and belonging. But it is, I think, that willingness to step into the arena, as we talk about, and take the buy-in of heartbreak and be willing to feel that pain that comes from it. Because I don't think there is belonging without that risk.
Yeah.
And it's virtually in some ways has made the risk easier.
And I think the desperation for it also kind of confuses what the intimacy can look like.
Mm.
Because
Totally.
when people are at like those upper limits of like really craving it so much, then sometimes those are the moments when we bring someone into our inner circle that maybe we shouldn't have, or not realizing that there's like a forced closeness that doesn't end up getting sustained, because
Yeah.
it's more from a time when maybe we weren't feeling completely whole. And so it's it comes up quicker, and it's easier to disengage.
Yeah, and I know, because I'm dating now, and I've dated on and off during the pandemic, but not very much, and a lot of it was online. That so much of what I've noticed within it is using the dating apps as a way of creating a false sense of intimacy,
Mhm.
of having a conversation with someone just over text. Really, and I always think that conversation is with myself. It's not really with the other person, because I'm reading it through my lens and the way I read things. But trying to find intimacy in that realm, and I know that's not real intimacy, but it filled that void of loneliness. Whereas I'm sitting here thinking, and even in those moments, why am I going here? I have I have two men's groups. I have a ton of friends,
Mhm.
and yet this is a space, because in some ways I'm not actually being intimate. I can
Mhm.
create the experience of it without actually putting my heart on the line.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think it's useful, and it also has a great cost. And as you said, it's very confusing, and it challenging space to exist in, where intimacy is so accessible, but at least in my experience, it's not real. It's not on
Yeah.
solid ground.
And I think the artificial nature in which social media creates such a huge dopamine hit for us, and it's so addictive that it's really put the relationship context and intimacy into this like machine locked and loaded source of like the brain can't handle how many potential people. And like on TikTok, which I'm also like since COVID addicted to, which is like terrible for your brain, like you just sense it, and but there's a sense of intimacy that's created, of seeing people that you might follow, and seeing certain like such a brief insight into someone's life, right? And these are moments that we never would have had pre-social media, where you would be interacting with as many people in such an intense format. And like even going on other social media platforms and seeing in 2 seconds a rush of everyone's deepest questions and anxieties, and how much is just out there to be
Mhm.
consumed. And I think for people who are struggling with loneliness and trying to find a sense of intimacy, there's a really contradictory process that can happen because they seek out those types of platforms, and then it's more meaningless, it's less connected and authentic, and so then it kind of creates more of that disconnect. And so I've had clients say, you know what, I'm going to take a social media break, and they really report that it's really helpful for them. I haven't reached that step in my recovery yet.
Yeah, I can tell you I've been off Instagram and Facebook for months, and it's the best choice that I've made. I don't miss it at all. So I highly recommend it.
We'll have to follow up and see if I'm able to make progress.
I know we have some questions. We had some questions
Yes.
before the session that some folks sent us. So thank you. Should we tackle some of those?
Let's do it. So we have one question here, which is, how do men perceive romance and being romantic?
You want to jump in?
Why don't you take it, Nick?
I'm going to say, I think often, and I'm thinking of conversations in our men's groups over the years. I think romance often is equated with doing and fixing, right? So the doing is having sex. The doing is going out on date night. The doing is sending flowers. The doing is doing the errands around the house that need to get done, that haven't been done in a couple of weeks, and if you don't get them done, you're going to be in trouble and in the doghouse, right? And yes, those are all elements. Those are all elements that can create a romantic experience, especially if that's what turns your partner on, right? If that's what floats their boat. I also believe, and this goes back to a point that that we made at the very beginning. Romance is also about being still and being with, that quietness and holding space for the other person. My partner, for example, her parents are in their late 80s, and they're struggling with their health. And what I provide, I believe the value that I provide is asking her questions and actually being present and being with and being empathetic to what she's sharing. There's no fixing, there's no advice that I'm giving, there's no recommendations. I mean, obviously if she asks me, right, that may be the next step. And she hasn't asked. All she's asked is, can you just be there to just listen to me, right? When I get off the phone with the doctor or get with their health coordinator, whatever, when I get off the phone with them, can you just be there? And so to me, romance is all of those things. Buy the flowers, be physical, go on date night, and be with, support your partner, be present, ask questions, get in their world. I love what you said about the platinum rule. It's like, think 10 steps ahead. Like, that's romance. It's like, what would my partner want after knowing that they've had the kind of day that they've had without them having to ask for it?
Yeah, I think that's so great. And I think there's, it's really hard when we're so immersed in our own stressors sometimes that it's really hard to create space for someone else. But then it also becomes kind of a negative cycle, because if we're only stuck in seeing our own vantage point, it becomes really hard to make space for someone else. But if you're able to do that, like gift of the Magi stuff, where both people are trying to give to each other, then it makes for such a better coexistence.
Yeah, it reminds me, when I was thinking about intimacy beforehand, I hadn't mentioned this yet. It's, meeting in the middle. And sometimes that middle is further on one side or the other, but it requires both parties coming together. And Nick and I often talk about loving the relationship more than yourself. And I hear that in what you're saying, Nick, which is, and sometimes that means loving the other person more, and sometimes that means loving you more, and sometimes it means taking care of the relationship itself. And I definitely feel that's part of romance. I love the idea of thinking 10 steps ahead. What's really going to take care of my person? Because I think that really does show care and love in a different way.
And the idea that a lot of times men think that women or their partner want them to solve their problems, but they really just want them to listen to them.
Yes.
It's really powerful. And I think for men and women, there's this book, Come As You Are. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it talks a lot about what are the accelerators and what are the brakes in terms of relationships. And I think that's kind of an interesting, it's an individual kind of question in terms of like, what are those turn-ons, turn-offs, and like things that help generate intimacy, and what are the things that are like full stop. It would be impossible to conjure that up. But I think those are good conversations to have, I think, in the dating context or in general, like when you're starting to learn about someone and like, what are those things that kind of would pull us closer together and what would make us disconnect.
Yeah, I remember when I was in a relationship for 4 years, and something that came up often, and it's come up with other men that I know, is there'd be an argument or disagreement, and I'd go buy flowers or something or chocolates, and the response would be, I don't want you to do this now.
Right.
I want you to have done this earlier.
Yeah.
And it does go into that fixing mindset. I know as a man, I have this tendency when things are uncomfortable, like I want to make it as less uncomfortable for me. So I am no longer uncomfortable. And that was what always those gestures were for. And as I'm sitting here now thinking about it, that's thinking 10 steps ahead, is not being responsive in showing adoration, but not being responsive or reactive, but being proactive in doing it before it's necessitated.
And also, and that performative quality of like, let me do this and check a box and then we'll be close again, right? Like, tell me how to fix this and then we're going to be okay. As opposed to hearing like, well, what is the pain that happened? And like, how do we just validate and sit with that response? This is something that I'm doing now with my husband, because we were all sick on Mother's Day. And so it's this, now Father's Day is coming up and we were talking about like this dynamic, and he's like, what can I get you for Mother's Day? And I'm like, no, I just want you to validate that there was no Mother's Day. Like, that, like this was just a time and something happened. Like, it's not like but like that idea of like, oh, let me fix it. Like, I want to make this better. And sometimes it's that offering of like that stillness that you're talking about, Nick, of just sitting and saying like, oh yeah, like you got robbed this year. Like, okay.
Yeah, I think we also sometimes men, again, I'm making a generalization. We almost have this, like, I want to be a good boy, for mom, I want to prove myself to dad, versus, and that's, again, the fixing and the doing versus just being still and being quiet. One of our participants said, to your point, Jake, but also applies to what you just describing, Jessica, are you buying the flowers for her or for you, right? That's it's a really good point. You reminded me also, I think, going back to the question about romance, and I think this what I'm about to share is also applicable in the corporate space. I think intimacy comes in the form of surprise.
Yeah.
Being mysterious and surprising another human. I mean, that's one of the, when I work with organizations who have highly engaged cultures, they have a culture of surprising people. And I don't mean surprising them like in a bad way, but surprising them like in a way that causes awe and laughter and connection. We haven't even, we're just getting to it now. I mean, intimacy comes in the form of surprise. Again, surprise because I'm thinking of what you want, right? Or what would, what's the space you're in right now? And I'm going to surprise you. I'm going to create awe and mystery and something really, really wonderful for you. And again, not from like, remove myself from the equation. I'm just a vessel to have that surprise happen.
Yeah. And I think
love that.
Of giving someone something that they don't even realize that they want. Like for our 10-year wedding anniversary, my husband did this like amazingly awesome thing where he found this like guitarist / boat captain and like got us like to this like private island where we were the only people there, and had our friends like babysitting. It was like a very involved process, and like the cupcakes were personalized, and then like on the way back the captain, who was the guitarist, is like serenading us, and like it was like creating this whole experience. And I think going back to that idea of that doing, one of the psychological understandings of it is that when we're not able to put our feelings into words, it comes out in our actions.
Mm.
And so I think that in it, like that desire to repair that Jake, you were talking about like, here, look, like, this is how much I care. See, this is what it is. Like, it's hard to put words to that experience of that gesture, and to say, look, I care so much. How do I make this right? And, speaking to that.
So I think we probably have time for maybe one more question before we wrap up. This hour has zoomed by.
No pun
No pun,
intended.
but kind of
Ba-dum-bum.
pun intended.
Yeah, we're here every Thursday, folks.
I don't know if you come here for the laughs, but
Right.
So let me see what would be.
Can,
We had a couple questions about partners, and one of them is, can you speak more about intimacy with our partners? And another was, as a partner, how can I help someone face their issues beyond just being supportive? And maybe we wrap up there.
I think one of the ways to do that is to sometimes you have to generate that feeling of vulnerability and intimacy and take a risk and see then what happens, right? Sometimes we ask for too much from our partner. Sometimes it's in those moments when we say, we're putting it on them, and then it becomes the attack and you're accused, and then that's going to create a much more defensive reaction, as opposed to like, here's something I'm really struggling with, and just putting yourself out there and seeing, does that get mirrored?
Yeah, I love that. I would say, Jake, the answer we may have answered the question already, right? Which is why, the question is, how can I help someone face their issues beyond just being supportive? Why isn't that considered enough, right? And I appreciate the question, right? So it's not making the question wrong in any way. Rather, as a society, we have it that, we have to always do things, right? And, even, I remember to this day, my dad passed away 25 years ago. And to this day, what I remember most was the energy, the sentiments, the feelings people had. I don't remember like who sent me food to the house, right? Or who did us favors. I mean, bless them for doing it. But what I'm saying is, what the support is what people need, actually. We live in an isolated world. The world is set up that way to be competitive, to be win-lose. You're a Red Sox fan. I'm a fan of the good guys, the Yankees. But seriously, we live in a world that I think often divides us. And I think being supportive is everything, actually. I'll say one more thing about it. If you want to take it a step further, if you think there still is a step further, then you think of it. It's kind of like in the, the diversity, inclusion, belonging, equity conversation. One of the best things you could do for others is for you to get educated. Like, you go get educated. Stop asking them what they want. Like, you go do the work. Stop putting on everybody else. There's so many times in our men's groups where someone will share intimately, vulnerably, openly, and then people will send emails and say, I'm here if you need me. And it like makes my head, I want to blow my head wants to blow up. It's like, congratulations that you're here for them. Like, find a way to be supportive. Either ask them how you can support them, which is what we're talking about. And like, think 10 steps ahead, like, put yourself in their world. What would be supportive? Give it a shot at least, versus, hey, I'm here if you need me. It makes my skin crawl when people say that.
Yeah, I'm with you, Nick. I always make a mental note of it, because I remember we had a conversation in one of our men's groups years ago. That's the perfect way of being performative without actually delivering. That it's the nice to have. It's like, I'm here for you, versus I always make the mental note, okay, when something happens, can I check in the next week, or can I ask that person, what do you need from me? And I think that's how I would answer this question. How can you be supportive beyond supportive with a partner, is to explore what else support can look like. And if you're struggling to find support, or the person's not receptive, to ask them to ask them, what do you need from me? What are you open with? Where are you struggling right now? And if they're not willing to have that conversation, I think that's for you to evaluate, what kind of relationship do I want to be in? How do I want to support my partner? How do I want to be supported? And it's definitely a two-way street. There's no right answer to this question, that's for sure.
And maybe it brings up people's powerlessness and helplessness, right? Like when they're hearing the stories and people say like, okay, I'm here if you need anything, like maybe part of what they're communicating is like, I don't know how to help. I don't know what
Totally.
to do.
Totally.
And there's like, I'm completely at a loss, and like, you tell me. And that's kind of when people put more of the pressure. I think it's hard to recognize. I think another thing that I would include, just in terms of the expectation that's asked in terms of increasing this intimacy, is to look for the template the person's operating off of, right? What was their father's interaction? What was their parents' relationship like? What is the blueprint that they're creating? And to try to come from a place of compassion about that, as opposed to putting them on the line and judging them and the person before you. Like, see them as the child of the product of that. And I think that brings about kind of a softer type of space that might cultivate more of the intimacy, as opposed to what's wrong with him, why is he like this,
Right.
And that frustration.
Well, we've reached 8:01 and we promised an hour, so we're gonna wrap up. Jessica, Dr. Koblenz, thank you for joining us today. Nick, a great conversation.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank all of you else, everyone who's been on here for the full hour, for joining us tonight for Men in Intimacy. And if you're a man and you've enjoyed this conversation, please consider coming as a guest to mine and Nick's Arena Men's Group. Like Nick said, we meet twice a month on Zoom to explore conversations like this and support each other to be men in the arena in all the areas of our life that matter most to us. In a second, I'm going to put up a final screen just with my contact info, Nick's contact info, and Dr. Koblenz's contact info. And we'll be back sometime in the next 6 weeks with another Arena Series podcast. So keep an eye out for an announcement on that. We'd love to have you join us again. And thank you all for being here. Again, give me one moment while I just put up our final screen and we'll say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Have a good night. Stay safe.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming and being here with us tonight.
Thanks so much.
If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Our emails are here on the screen.
Thank you so much for organizing.
Yeah, thanks for being with us, Jessica.
Thanks.
It's been
Have a
great to spend the hour with you.
Yeah, as always. Thank you all. Have a great night.